The star of one of the most beloved black sitcoms in television history got fired for demanding that his character be treated with dignity. When Good Times premiered on CBS in February 1974, Esther Rolle, John Amos, and Jimmie Walker brought the Evans family to life inside Chicago's Cabrini-Green housing projects. And for the first time, a two-parent black household held the center of network television. But behind the catchphrases and the laugh track were firings, walkouts, and creative battles that nearly tore the show apart from the inside. Here are 21 of those stories, the kind we uncover every week here on Mystery Crunch, counting down to the one that still haunts everyone involved. Number 21. It's a spin-off of a spin-off. Good Times didn't start from scratch. It's actually a spin-off of Maude, which was itself a spin-off of All in the Family. Esther Rolle first appeared as Florida Evans Maude Finlay's sharp, no-nonsense housekeeper in 1972. The character landed so well that Norman Lear built an entire series around her. That makes Good Times one of television's only second-generation spin-offs, a show, born from another show. The All in the Family universe eventually spawned 5 separate series, but Good Times traveled the farthest from its origin. But the casting surprises didn't stop with Esther Rolle. Number 20. The Evans family never set foot in Cabrini-Green. The show is set in Chicago's Cabrini-Green housing projects, and the Evans apartment feels claustrophobic and real. But the cast never filmed a single scene there. Every episode was shot on a soundstage at CBS Television City in Hollywood. The exterior shots of the housing towers were stock footage, and the apartment set was designed to feel deliberately cramped. The kitchen, living room, and front door were all visible in a single camera setup on purpose. The production team studied real public housing floor plans in Chicago, but the closest the show ever got to the actual Cabrini-Green was a photograph taped to the writer's room wall. And the youngest member of that cast? He was already more experienced than most of the adults. Ralph Carter was 12 and already a Broadway star. Ralph Carter, who played the politically conscious youngest son Michael Evans, was just 12 years old when filming began in 1973. But he wasn't some wide-eyed kid plucked from an open call. Carter had already starred on Broadway in Raisin, the musical adaptation of A Raisin in the Sun, and won a Theatre World Award for his performance. He was one of the youngest actors to carry a recurring role on a network sitcom at that time, and his on-screen intelligence wasn't entirely acting. The cast and crew consistently described Carter as one of the sharpest people in the room. Speaking of hidden talents in the cast, one of them had a secret musical legacy most people never knew about. Number 18. Jeanette DuBois sang one of TV's most famous theme songs for a different show. Jeanette DuBois played Willona Woods, the Evans family's sharp-tongued, fashion-forward neighbor, for all 6 seasons. But her biggest musical contribution to television wasn't on Good Times at all. She co-wrote and performed Movin' On Up, the iconic theme song for the Jeffersons. That show premiered in January 1975, just 11 months after Good Times, and its theme became one of the most recognized songs in TV history. DuBois never received the kind of public credit she deserved for it during her lifetime, and many fans of the Jeffersons had no idea the voice behind that song belonged to Willona Woods. Of course, getting onto the show in the first place was its own battle, especially for the actress who played Thelma. Number 17. BernNadette Stanis beat out hundreds for the role of Thelma. More than 600 young actresses reportedly auditioned for the role of Thelma Evans, and BernNadette Stanis, a 16-year-old from Brooklyn with almost no screen credits, walked away with it. Norman Lear picked her because she had the exact mix of warmth and toughness the character demanded. Stanis became one of the first young black women on network TV portrayed as intelligent and fully dimensional, not reduced to a type. She stayed with the show for all 6 seasons, becoming one of its quiet, steadying anchors. And then there was the moment that turned a throwaway ad-lib into the most famous word on television. Number 16. Dy-No-Mite was never supposed to be a catchphrase. Jimmie Walker's explosive Dy-No-Mite became the show's signature, but it was never written into a script. Walker ad-libbed the word during an early episode. The studio audience erupted, and the writers immediately started building it into future scripts. Within a year, it was on t-shirts, lunchboxes, and bumper stickers across the country. Walker later said the catchphrase took on a life he couldn't control. He couldn't walk down a street without someone shouting it at him. What started as a spontaneous moment became one of the most recognized catchphrases in 70s television. It also became, eventually, a flashpoint for a much deeper conflict on set. But before that storm broke, there was another performer quietly making himself indispensable. Number 15, Johnny Brown. Made Bookman his own. Johnny Brown, who played Building Superintendent Nathan Bookman, better known as Buffalo Butt, to the Evans kids wasn't originally written as a major recurring presence. But Brown's physical comedy and timing were so sharp that the writers kept expanding his appearances season after season. Much of Bookman's humor came from Brown's own improvisation. He would riff during rehearsals, and the best lines ended up in the finished scripts. Brown stayed loyal to the show through every backstage upheaval and rarely spoke publicly about the tensions around him. Fans consistently rank Bookman among the most underrated sitcom characters of the era. Now the deeper stories start here. And the first one involves two future late-night legends hiding in plain sight. Number 14, Jimmie Walker secretly hired David Letterman and Jay Leno to write his jokes. As J.J. Evans became the show's breakout star, Jimmie Walker wanted to keep his comedy razor sharp, so he did something almost unheard of for a sitcom actor in the mid-1970s. He hired his own private stable of outside joke writers. Among them were two unknown, struggling stand-up comedians named David Letterman and Jay Leno. Walker paid them out of his own pocket to punch up his lines before tapings. Letterman later credited the arrangement as one of his first steady writing gigs in Hollywood, and Leno has spoken about it in interviews for decades. But the arrangement didn't go over well. The show's official writing staff felt undermined, complaining that Walker was rewriting their scripts without permission. It also deepened a growing rift between Walker and his co-stars, who saw the extra jokes as pulling the show further from its serious, family-centered roots. Number 13, Good Times was a certified ratings giant. It's easy to forget just how massive Good Times was. In its second season, the show cracked the Nielsen Top 10, regularly drawing over 30 million viewers a week. For a sitcom centered entirely on a black family living in poverty, a premise no network had dared to try before those numbers were staggering. CBS initially gave the show a Tuesday night time slot, uncertain about its commercial potential, but audience demand forced the network to lock it into a prime position. The show's success proved something the networks had been reluctant to believe. Stories about black families living paycheck to paycheck weren't niche, they were universal. Together with Sanford and Son and the Jeffersons, Good Times formed a trio that redefined who got to occupy the center of a primetime schedule. Advertisers took notice. CBS charged premium rates for commercial spots during the show's peak seasons, recognizing that this audience was both massive and fiercely loyal. And one of the show's most distinctive visual elements came from the last place anyone would have expected a professional football field. Number 12, JJ, paintings, were by a former NFL lineman. One of the most memorable details of Good Times is JJ's artwork, the bold, elongated, kinetic paintings hanging in the Evans apartment. Those weren't prop department throwaways. Every one of them was painted by Ernie Barnes, a former offensive lineman who spent 5 seasons in the American Football League, playing for the New York Titans, the San Diego Chargers, and the Denver Broncos before walking away from the sport to become a full-time artist. Barnes' signature-style muscular, stretched figures caught in motion became the show's visual identity. His piece Sugar Shack, which appeared prominently on Good Times, later became one of the most widely reproduced works of African-American art in history. Marvin Gaye used it as the cover for his 1976 album I Want You. Barnes once said his art career truly began the night millions of television viewers saw his work hanging in the Evans family's living room. A football player's canvases became the soul of a sitcom set, and then became iconic American art. Nobody predicted that path, but behind the camera, the creative battles were far less artful. Number 11, Norman Lear. Fought CBS on almost every controversial storyline. Norman Lear was the most powerful producer in 1970s television, but that didn't mean CBS gave him a blank check. Network executives pushed back on storylines constantly, worrying that plots involving gang violence, drug abuse, unemployment, and systemic racism would drive away sponsors. Lear fought for every single one of them. One of the longest battles involved an episode about the Evans family's inability to afford health care. CBS wanted the ending softened, and Lear refused to budge. He also clashed repeatedly with the network over how explicitly the show could portray poverty. Executives preferred the family to seem aspirational, while Lear insisted that the cramped apartment, the hand-me-down clothes, and the empty refrigerator were the entire point. These weren't polite creative disagreements, they were heated confrontations in conference rooms. Lear later said that Good Times was the show where he fought hardest for authenticity, because the network's deepest fear was making white audiences uncomfortable with the reality of Black poverty in urban America. And into the middle of all that tension walked a 10-year-old girl who would one day become one of the biggest stars on the planet. Number 10, a young Janet Jackson joined the cast and raised the emotional stakes. In season 5, a 10-year-old Janet Jackson joined Good Times as Penny Gordon Woods, a young girl who becomes Wilona's adopted daughter. The storyline that introduced Penny was among the most harrowing in sitcom history up to that point. Penny is a victim of severe child abuse at the hands of her biological mother, and the episodes depicting her trauma were played almost entirely straight, with barely a joke in sight. Jackson's performance stunned audiences and critics. She delivered a raw, unguarded vulnerability that most child actors on network television simply couldn't reach. The role wasn't originally written for her. Several young actresses were considered before Norman Lear saw Jackson in an audition and cast her immediately. Penny's storyline helped push network television toward addressing child abuse as a serious social issue, and it gave Janet Jackson her first sustained national exposure years before she became a global pop. Number 9, Esther Rolle publicly attacked her own show. Esther Rolle didn't keep her frustrations behind closed doors. As JJ's clowning gradually consumed the show's airtime, Rolle went to the press more than once and said exactly what she thought. In interviews, she described the JJ character as a modern-day minstrel figure, arguing openly that the buffoonery was replacing the dignity the show had been built to represent. She was particularly furious that the show's Black father figure had been written out while a caricature remained front and center. In a widely cited interview with Ebony magazine, Rolle said she felt the show had become negative and degrading in its portrayal of Black family life. These weren't offhand remarks. They were deliberate public statements from the show's lead actress while the show was still airing on CBS. That kind of open dissent was nearly unheard of in 1970s network television. Rolle wasn't negotiating behind the scenes. She was making her case in print, in public, under her own name, and she didn't flinch. But the public criticism only hinted at a deeper story, one that started with the man who dreamed the whole show up. Number 8, Eric Monte built Good Times from his own childhood. Good Times wasn't dreamed up in a writer's room brainstorm. It came directly from Eric Monte's real life. Monte grew up in Chicago's Cabrini-Green housing projects, and the Evans family was drawn from what he'd lived and witnessed. A hardworking father holding the household together against impossible odds, a mother keeping everyone's spirits intact, children navigating poverty and violence while still chasing an education. Monte had already co-written the 1975 film Cooley High, another story rooted in his Chicago upbringing, and he brought that same autobiographical honesty to Good Times. The cramped apartment, the nosy but loyal neighbors, the daily arithmetic of making ends meet, none of it was invented from scratch. Monte later said that James Evans was directly inspired by real men he'd known in the projects, fathers who worked multiple jobs and never received a word of credit for holding their families together. The show's emotional center wasn't the product of Hollywood imagination. It was someone's actual childhood, translated to a CBS soundstage 3,000 miles from home. Now we're into the final 7, and these are the stories that changed the show forever. Number 7, John Amos was fired for caring too much. John Amos played James Evans Sr., the strong, principled, hard-working father who was the emotional spine of Good Times. He was the character who made the show's premise revolutionary. and the producers removed him after season 3. The conflict had been building for more than a year. Amos was increasingly outspoken about his belief that the show was abandoning its original purpose, clashing with writers over scripts that sidelined serious family storylines in favor of JJ's comedy. He pushed back specifically on episodes where James was reduced to a background figure while JJ mugged for the studio audience. Amos wanted Good Times to be about a family, not a catchphrase. According to multiple accounts, the friction between Amos and the production team became unworkable. Norman Lear, who had generally sympathized with Amos's creative instincts, ultimately sided with the network and the writing staff. The departure was announced publicly as a mutual decision, but Amos made it clear in later interviews that he hadn't chosen to leave. He'd wanted the show to be better. His exit ripped a hole in the series that was never repaired. Good Times had been built on the radical idea that a Black father could be present, loving, and central to a network family. When Amos walked off that soundstage, that idea walked with him. And the way the show chose to handle his absence created one of the most devastating scenes in television history. Number 6, the death of James Evans, broke an entire studio audience. When John Amos left, the writers had to explain his character's absence, and they chose the hardest possible route. In the season 4 premiere, the Evans family learns that James has been killed in a car accident in Mississippi, where he'd traveled chasing a job opportunity. The episode plays like a slow gut punch. The family gathers in the apartment, cycling through shock, anger, and grief, trying to hold one another together. Florida keeps her composure through every scene strong, steady. Then, in the final moments, she's alone in the kitchen. She picks up a glass punch bowl, whispers, "Damn, damn, damn," and to the floor. The studio audience, which had been laughing at lighter moments just minutes earlier, went completely silent. Then people began to cry. Esther Rolle later said she drew that moment from a deeply personal place. The grief was genuine, even though the circumstances were scripted. The scene is still cited as a landmark in how sitcoms could handle real tragedy without cheapening it. And the layer beneath it made it even heavier. The audience was mourning a character whose actor had been pushed out for demanding better. The grief on screen mirrored a grief behind the scenes. Everyone in that studio felt it. And for Esther Rolle, the breaking point was still ahead. Number 5, Esther Rolle walked away, then came back on her own terms. By the end of season 4, Esther Rolle had watched the show kill off its patriarch, lean harder into JJ's antics, and drift further from the family drama she'd signed on to lead. She'd had enough. Rolle did not return for season 5. The producers tried to fill the gap by expanding Willona's role and bringing in Janet Jackson's Penny character. But without both parents, Good Times lost the structural center that had made it unlike anything else on television. Ratings slid. Behind the scenes, the production team knew the show was in serious trouble, and they approached Rolle about coming back for a 6th season. This time, she had leverage, and she used every bit of it. Rolle agreed to return, but only under specific conditions. JJ's character had to be significantly toned down, the family had to be portrayed with more dignity, and the scripts had to return to stories about real issues facing Black families in America. The producers accepted every demand. Rolle came back for the 6th and final season, and the shift was visible from the first episode. JJ was more grounded, the writing more serious, and the finale gave Florida a proper, earned ending. It was too late to rescue the ratings. But Rolle had made her point. She didn't just return to the show, she returned with a contract that said it had to mean something again. What the audience never fully understood was just how deep the personal fractures behind the scenes had gone. Number 4. The cast tensions were more painful than anyone admitted. The public story of the Good Times conflicts Amos and Rolle versus the JJ direction is well documented, but the private dynamics were uglier and more personal than any press interview revealed. Jimmie Walker has said openly that he and Esther Rolle barely spoke to each other off camera for years. He did not attend her funeral when she passed in 1998. Walker has described the relationship as professional but cold, and he's been candid about his belief that Rolle resented his personal success rather than objecting to the show's creative direction. Rolle, for her part, never softened her position. She maintained until the end of her life that the show had been hijacked from its original mission. John Amos has spoken more diplomatically in interviews, but his frustration has always been clear. He felt the show's predominantly white writing staff didn't grasp the weight of portraying a black family in primetime, and too often treated the characters as setup lines rather than human beings. BernNadette Stanis and Ralph Carter have both spoken about feeling trapped in the middle, too young and too low on the call sheet to change the outcome, but old enough to feel the tension at every single table read. What millions of viewers experienced as a warm family sitcom was, behind the cameras, a workplace fractured by race, creative vision, and bruised egos. The smiles between takes were sometimes the best performances anyone on that set ever gave. The full cast has never done a reunion, and now, with several members gone, they never will. And the person who may have paid the highest price of all was the man who started it. Number 3. Eric Monte's lawsuit exposed how Hollywood treated black creators. Eric Monte didn't just co-create Good Times. He also co-wrote Cooley High and claimed a creative role in developing What's Happening, which drew on characters from that film. But Monte alleged that he had been systematically shut out of the financial rewards. In the late 1970s, he filed lawsuits against CBS, Norman Lear's Tandem Productions, and several other parties, claiming he'd been denied proper writing credits, residuals, and creative control over properties he had originated. Monte said the studios took his stories pulled directly from his childhood and his community, and handed them to white writers who collected the credit and the paychecks of court. But Monte has maintained for decades that he never received anything close to fair compensation. The financial aftermath was devastating. By the 1990s, reports surfaced of Monte living in severe financial hardship. The man who'd co-created one of the most successful black television shows in history, struggling to make rent. Monte's trajectory became a cautionary tale about how the entertainment industry extracted stories from black creators and black communities without giving them lasting ownership or equity. Decades before the industry-wide conversations about representation and fair compensation that define Hollywood today, Eric Monte was making those arguments in courtrooms. Almost nobody listened. But the show he built left behind something the lawsuits and the arguments couldn't erase. Number 2, Good Times was the first, and it changed what television could be. Before Good Times, no network sitcom had ever centered on a two-parent black family living in realistic economic circumstances. The Jeffersons, which launched a year later, depicted upward mobility and affluence. Sanford and Son was structured around a widower and his adult son. Good Times was the only show on American television that said, "This is what it looks like when a black family is poor, the father is still present, the mother is still fighting, and the children are still dreaming." That was a genuinely radical act in 1974. The show's first 2 seasons, when the Evans family unit was fully intact, remain some of the most culturally significant episodes in American television history. They proved in hard Nielsen numbers that black stories about ordinary, daily survival could hold a primetime audience of tens of millions. Every black family sitcom that followed, from The Cosby Show to Black-ish to The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, exists in the creative and cultural space that Good Times opened first. Scholars, filmmakers, and novelists have cited the show as a reference point for authentic on-screen representation. Its flaws are real and well-known the later seasons, the JJ problem, the loss of its creator's voice, but so is its legacy. Good Times didn't just reflect black life in America. For millions of people who had never once seen their own household on a television screen, it proved their stories were worth telling in the first place. And behind all of it, behind the scripts, the laughter, the arguments, the legacy, there's one story that makes everything else land harder. Number 1. The real Cabrini-Green makes everything about this show. Hit Different Good Times was set in Cabrini-Green, but the version audiences saw every week was already softened for a network sitcom. The real Cabrini-Green, during the exact years the show was on the air, was one of the most dangerous public housing complexes in the United States. Gang violence, grinding poverty, chronic neglect by the city, and near total abandonment by municipal services defined everyday life inside those towers. Residents dealt with broken elevators that went unrepaired for months, no heat during brutal Chicago winters, and the constant presence of gunfire. The show touched on pieces of that reality, but CBS couldn't broadcast all of it in a primetime half hour, and the writers knew it. What Good Times did accomplish was something subtler and arguably more important. It gave a human face to a place that most of America only encountered through crime statistics and news footage. Eric Monte, who grew up there, understood that the people of Cabrini-Green were not data points. They were families like the Evans' parents working double shifts, kids doing homework by lamplight, neighbors looking out for each other because nobody else would. The buildings themselves are gone now. The city of Chicago demolished the Cabrini-Green towers between 1995 and 2011, replacing them with mixed-income developments that the vast majority of original residents could not afford to return to. The community that inspired the show was erased physically, economically, and demographically. But the show endures. Florida, James, JJ, Thelma, and Michael were fictional characters. The world they inhabited was not, and for the families across America who recognized that world the very first time they saw it on screen, even filtered through a Hollywood soundstage, seeing it at all meant everything. Good Times ran for 6 seasons, 133 episodes, and more backstage arguments than most shows survive. It was messy, groundbreaking, infuriating, and necessary, sometimes all in the same half hour. The Evans family deserved better from the industry that created them. But they gave us something that outlasted all of it. Subscribe to Mystery Crunch. We've got plenty more stories like